When the doctor told this young girl that she had a life-threatening illness, her whole world seemed to shatter. The doctor only mentioned that treatment was possible, but the real issue was much bigger. The girl came from a poor family, and her parents had already struggled to fund her education. Now, the treatment would be extremely expensive, and they simply couldn't afford it. The girl had a passion for painting. She thought, why not try making and selling my paintings? Maybe I can earn some money to afford the treatment, but she had no idea what was about to happen to her, something she had never even imagined. Stay tuned until the end. I hope you love it. Before we continue, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Sophie Carter had always loved to paint. Ever since she was a little girl, she found comfort in the soft glide of a brush against canvas, the way colors blended together to create something new. While other kids played outside, she spent hours at her bedroom desk, lost in worlds of swirling blues and fiery reds. Art wasn't just a hobby, it was her escape. But now it had become something more. Now it was a lifeline. At just 16, Sophie was facing a battle far greater than anything she had ever imagined. A few months ago, she had been a normal teenager, worrying about school projects and weekend plans. But then the fatigue set in, the bruises that wouldn't fade, the sharp pain in her bones that left her breathless. The diagnosis hit like a freight train: leukemia. In an instant, her world shattered. The doctors had been clear: she needed treatment immediately, chemotherapy, hospital stays, medications. It was the only way to fight. And fight she did. Her parents, Mark and Linda Carter, were hard-working people. Her father was a construction worker, her mother a receptionist at a dental office. They had done everything right, saved money, paid their bills on time, but nothing could have prepared them for the financial devastation that came with a cancer diagnosis. The first round of chemo drained their savings. The second forced them to take out loans. By the time the doctors told them Sophie needed one more round to give her the best chance of survival, they had nothing left to give. Sophie had overheard the late-night whispers between her parents, the muffled sobs, the guilt in their voices when they thought she was asleep. They had tried everything: charity applications, crowdfunding, pleading with the insurance company. But the answer was always the same: denied. She knew they were breaking under the weight of it all, and that realization hurt worse than the illness itself. She didn't want to be the reason they lost everything, so she made a decision. If they couldn't afford her treatment, she would find a way to pay for it herself. The idea came to her late one night as she lay in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. Art had always been her passion, but what if it could be her salvation too? If people saw her work, maybe, just maybe, they would buy it. Not out of pity, but because they truly loved it. And if she could sell enough, she could afford the treatment that could save her life. So, with the little strength she had left, she painted. Every spare moment was spent creating: sunrises bursting with gold and crimson, moonlit oceans swirling with mystery, portraits of strangers whose eyes seemed to hold entire stories. She poured everything into her work: her pain, her hope, her desperate need to survive. When she looked at the finished pieces, she didn't just see paintings, she saw chances. With the help of her mother, she set up a small art stand on a busy downtown street. A simple wooden table, a few easels, and a sign explaining her cause. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. On the first morning, she took a deep breath, smiled, and waited. But as the hours dragged on, reality set in. Most people barely glanced at her table. Some slowed down, admiring the artwork, only to shake their heads and walk away. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped long enough to read the sign, then scoffed and muttered something under his breath before disappearing into the crowd. Sophie's hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, refusing to let the frustration win. She wasn't giving up, not yet. Sophie sat behind her art stand, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edges of a canvas. The hours crawled by, each second stretching longer than the last. People passed. Some glanced at her paintings, some didn't even spare a second look. Hope flickered in her chest each time someone slowed down, only to fizzle out when they walked away without a word. She fought to keep the smile on her face, but inside doubt was creeping in. Her sign was clear: original art, funding my cancer treatment. But it didn't seem to matter. A group of teenagers walked by, snickering as they read it. One of them whispered something to his friend, shaking his head, before they disappeared into the crowd. Sophie swallowed hard, pretending she hadn't heard. Moments later, an older woman approached. She admired the paintings, running her fingers along the edges of a sunset landscape. Sophie's heart pounded as she waited. This could be it. "How much is this one, dear?" the woman asked, a kind smile on her face. Sophie sat up straighter. "It's $80, she said, keeping her voice steady. The woman's smile faltered. "Oh, I see." She set the painting down carefully, almost guiltily, and patted Sophie's hand. "You have a wonderful talent. I hope you sell them all." And just like that, she was gone. Sophie exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her dress. Wonderful talent. It was a nice sentiment, but kind words wouldn't pay for chemotherapy. She needed sales. She needed hope. A gust of wind kicked up, rustling the canvases and knocking one to the pavement. Sophie scrambled to pick it up, brushing dust off the corner. As she straightened, she caught sight of a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, dressed in an expensive suit, with sunglasses perched on his nose. A businessman. He looked like someone who could buy every painting on her table without a second thought. Her pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his gaze scanning the artwork. Sophie sat up, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "These yours?" he asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Yes, sir," Sophie said quickly. "I painted all of them." He studied them for a moment longer, then smirked. "They're good," he admitted, "but art's a tough business, kid. You should try something more practical." He nodded at her sign. "Cancer treatment, huh?" Sophie nodded, unsure of what to say. The man pulled out his wallet, and for a moment her heart soared. Was he going to buy one? Maybe even two? Instead, he pulled out a $1 bill, placed it on the table, and walked away. Sophie stared at the dollar for a long time, her vision blurring at the edges. A lump formed in her throat, but she refused to cry. She had come too far to break now, so she swallowed the pain, lifted her chin, and kept waiting. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Sophie shifted in her seat, stretching her aching back. The exhaustion was creeping in, the kind that settled deep in her bones, not just from sitting all day, but from the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. Would she make enough? Would she make anything at all? Just as she was beginning to lose hope, a strange hush fell over the street. The usual murmur of conversation faded. People slowed their steps, their heads turning in unison toward something or someone in the distance. Sophie, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere, followed their gazes. That's when she saw them. A group of men in dark suits moved through the crowd like a current parting the sea. Their eyes scanned the street, earpieces crackling softly as they murmured into hidden microphones. It didn't take long for people to recognize what this meant. Security detail, and not just any security detail, the kind that only surrounded the most powerful people in the world. Sophie's breath hitched. Someone important was here. A moment later, a figure stepped forward, his presence commanding without needing a word. Donald Trump. The former president, known for his towering frame and unmistakable confidence, paused in front of Sophie's art stand. His gaze swept over the canvases, lingering on each one. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stood there, studying her work, while the entire street seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. She barely noticed the growing crowd around them, phones appearing in hands, cameras flashing. People whispered excitedly, nudging each other. Why was he here? Why had he stopped? Then finally he spoke. "Did you paint these?" His voice was steady, deep, commanding yet curious. Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to nod. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Trump reached out, lifting one of the paintings, a breathtaking landscape of an American flag blowing in the wind against a sunset. He studied it for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he glanced at her sign. "You're selling these to pay for your chemo?" Sophie nodded again, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Trump was silent, his gaze lingering on the sign. Then, with a slow nod, he set the painting down and reached into his pocket. The world around Sophie seemed to freeze. The same man who had once signed billion-dollar deals stood in front of her, about to make a purchase. Sophie barely dared to breathe. What he did next would change everything. Trump's hand disappeared into his suit pocket, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The murmuring crowd leaned in, their eyes fixed on the former president, wondering what he would do next. Sophie, still gripping the edge of her table, could barely hear anything over the pounding of her own heart. When Trump's hand emerged, he wasn't holding just a bill. He was holding a thick stack of cash. The sight of it made Sophie's breath hitch. She had expected him to maybe buy a painting, maybe hand her a crisp $100 bill. But this was different. The energy around them shifted. People gasped. Someone whispered, "Is he really about to do this?" "How much for this one?" Trump finally asked, holding up the American flag painting. Sophie hesitated. $100, sir," she answered, her voice shaking. Trump studied the painting for a long moment. Then, with his usual confident smirk, he shook his head. "No," he said, "I'm paying more." Before Sophie could react, he placed 10 $100 bills on the table. $1,000 for a single painting. The crowd gasped. A woman in the back let out a quiet, "Oh my God!" Sophie's hands trembled as she stared at the money, barely able to comprehend what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could say a word, Trump leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "Tell me something," he said. "Why are you really out here?" Sophie swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. His expression was unreadable, not just curious, but serious. He wasn't just making a grand gesture. He wanted to understand. Taking a shaky breath, she spoke. "My parents, they've done everything they can, but we can't afford my last round of chemo." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "The insurance company denied our claim. We've tried everything. So I thought, if I could sell enough paintings, maybe I could save myself." The crowd, once buzzing with excitement, fell into a stunned silence. Even the security team, usually stone-faced, seemed moved by her words. Trump nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the painting. For the first time since he arrived, his expression softened. "You're a fighter," he said finally. "I respect that." Sophie blinked, unsure of how to respond. Then he did something no one expected. He pulled out his phone. "I'm making a call," he said, already dialing. "You're not paying for that chemo. I am." The air exploded with reaction. Gasps, cheers, a few scattered claps. It was as if the entire street had been struck by lightning. Sophie's vision blurred with tears she could no longer hold back. I don't know what to say," she choked out, barely able to believe what was happening. Trump gave her a small nod, as if to say she didn't need to. Then he turned to one of his assistants. "Get her in touch with the best cancer specialists in the country. I want everything taken care of." Sophie felt her mother's arms wrap around her from behind, her father's voice cracking with emotion as he murmured, "Thank you, Mr. Trump." Trump nodded once. "Your daughter has a gift," he said, gesturing to the paintings. "She should be painting for joy, not survival." Sophie wiped her tears, her hands still shaking. For the first time in months, she felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. The world around Sophie blurred, her mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. One moment she was sitting behind her tiny art stand, desperate for a single sale. The next, Donald Trump had just promised to pay for her entire cancer treatment. Her mother sobbed quietly beside her, holding on to her like she might disappear. Her father stood frozen, his eyes locked on Trump, as if trying to process the impossible reality before him. The crowd around them had erupted into a mix of stunned silence and hushed whispers. Even the security detail, usually impassive, exchanged subtle glances, as if they too were witnessing something unbelievable. Trump, however, remained calm, as if this was just another business deal. He turned to his assistant. "Get a full medical report on her case. Find the best specialists. No red tape, no delays. She gets the treatment she needs." Sophie covered her mouth with her hands, tears slipping down her cheeks. She stopped, her voice failing her. "I don't know how to thank you." Trump met her gaze. "Just promise me one thing." She swallowed hard, nodding. "Keep painting." A small, breathless laugh escaped her lips, half disbelief, half joy. "I will," she whispered. Trump turned to her father, shaking his hand firmly. "Your daughter is incredible, and after this is all over, I want one of her paintings, a special one." Her father's voice broke as he answered, "You got it, sir." The energy in the crowd had shifted. A moment ago, it had been curiosity, fascination. Now it was something deeper. People wiped away tears. Some clapped quietly. A woman in the back murmured, "I've never seen anything like this." Sophie looked down at her table, where Trump's money still sat, untouched. She had been painting for survival. But now, her fight was over. Trump adjusted his jacket, giving Sophie one last nod before turning back toward his motorcade. As his security cleared a path, a voice called out from the crowd, "Mr. Trump, why did you do this?" Trump paused, glancing over his shoulder. His answer was simple, "Because she deserves a chance." And just like that, he was gone. But for Sophie, everything had changed forever. By the time Sophie returned home that evening, the world had already heard her story. A bystander had recorded the entire encounter, and within hours, the video had gone viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with reactions: admiration, disbelief, inspiration. Strangers from across the country reached out, asking how they could help. Donations poured in. People who had never met Sophie wanted to buy her paintings, not just because of what she had been through, but because they saw the soul in her work. And just like that, her dream came true. With Trump's help, Sophie received the best treatment available. She fought with everything she had, and after months of uncertainty, the doctors finally gave her the news she had prayed for. She was cancer-free. But more than that, she was no longer just a girl fighting to survive. She was an artist with a future. Sometimes life changes in ways we never expect. Sophie had once believed her battle was hers alone, that survival meant struggling in silence. But one act of kindness from the most unexpected person changed everything. Donald Trump didn't just buy a painting. He gave her hope, a future, a second chance. And Sophie, she kept her promise. She painted, not for survival, but for joy. One of her paintings now hangs in Trump's office, a reminder that sometimes the right person walks by at the right time, and that a single moment of kindness can change a life forever.